We're grateful that you're joining us for today's webinar, The Ongoing Threat Environment, Impacts, and Security Considerations for the Jewish Community. As we'll hear today, we live in a heightened threat environment, which has been characterized by a rise in hate, extremism, and anti-Semitism, all of which have the potential to impact the safety and security of our community. This call represents the incredible work occurring in the Jewish community, from national organizations like ADL, JFNA, and SCN to local ones, federations, ADL offices, and community institutions, to come together to ensure not just our safety and security, but our future. This represents the best of who we are as a community and a people, and it is made possible by great leadership. To start us off, we are pleased to hear from two of those amazing leaders. First, the chair of ADL's Board of Directors, Esta Gordon-Epstein. Esta, the Zoom is yours.
Thank you, Michael. And thank you to everyone joining us today for your commitment to a better world and a safer Jewish community. I am always extremely proud of my long history with ADL. Fighting hate for good and fulfilling our mission to stop the defamation of the Jewish people and secure just and fair treatment to all has never been more relevant. But in my tenure as ADL's board chair, I don't know that I have been prouder than I was watching our staff spring into action around the horrific events at the Capitol last week. Our Center on Extremism has been working closely with law enforcement and played a key role in identifying many of the domestic terrorists who are now being brought to justice. Our teams continue to closely monitor the platforms, people, and dark places on the web still spreading hate and threatening violence. We are prepared for the long road ahead, and make no mistake, these extremists are not going away anytime soon. This is the battle of our lifetime. ADL will continue to call out those who enable anti-Semitism and hate and demand change. We will continue to respond and work to prevent anti-Semitic incidents around the country. This is the work we do every day, and the stakes have never been higher with levels of anti-Semitism soaring around the world. So again, I thank you for being here today for this important conversation. I want to commend the work of SCN and JFNA, and I am eager to hear from their leadership. Only by working together can we create a safe and thriving Jewish community. Thank you.
Thank you, Esta. It is now my distinct pleasure to welcome the chair of JFNA's Board of Trustees, Mark Wilf.
Thank you, Michael. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this important webinar. On behalf of JFNA's board, I want to acknowledge the great partnership we have with ADL and SCN working together on these critical issues. I also want to recognize particularly, in addition to the wonderful professional teams, two of my colleagues at JFNA, officers Julie Platt and Harold Gernsbacher, for their hard work leading on these security issues. We've all read and watched events over the past few weeks that have made us uneasy. Yet we were also gratified that calm was restored quickly and hopefully will be maintained during these next important days. Next week, we will witness the transfer of power to a new president. President-elect Biden has made clear that he will focus first on relief from the health pandemic, which continues to wreak havoc on cities across the globe. Death tolls related to COVID-19 are at alarming levels, and our social service sector has been overtaxed and under-resourced. We also know that one of the issues we want our elected officials on both sides of the aisle to recognize is rising anti-Semitism, hate, and extremism trends. Reflecting on the second anniversary of the Eitz Chaim Tree of Life attack, President-elect Biden has pledged to lead a comprehensive strategy for battling anti-Semitism and expanding investments in protection for faith-based institutions. As a community, we can help advance such protections by working with leaders from both parties, by ensuring our communal neighbors understand the perils we face and making sure that our communal members are fully educated about what's going on so we can keep our local communities safe. And that is one of the reasons we are gathered here today. We know that with great determination and conviction to our core values, our country can heal and grow stronger. And when that happens, our Jewish community will also thrive. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. ADL, JFNA, and SCN are working more closely than ever. At this time, I'm pleased to turn it over to one of the leaders and friends who has made that possible, ADL CEO and National Director, Jonathan Greenblatt.
Thank you, Michael. I appreciate the introduction, and it was great to hear from my friend Mark Wilf and my chair, Esther Epstein, a moment ago. I'm really delighted that ADL is able to offer this webinar today in partnership with Jewish Federations of North America and the Secure Community Network. I think it's evidence of the growing collaboration and real partnership between our three institutions that is designed to make our Jewish community safer, stronger, and more secure. And as Mark said, the events of last week really highlight the critical importance, almost the urgency of partnership and collaboration between our institutions. Last week's attack on our Capitol was the result of a steady, years-long escalation of hate. You know, that didn't start with Poway, it didn't start with Pittsburgh, it didn't start with Charlottesville, but those events have amplified and increased the threat profile. One could easily say, if you will, that there's a bookend between Charlottesville and Capitol Hill. Charlottesville opened this presidency with a demonstration of violent white supremacy, and the attack on Capitol Hill closes this administration with an ugly and broad demonstration of the power of right-wing extremism. And we all saw the Camp Auschwitz t-shirts, the swastikas, the Heil Hitler salutes. Look, I never would have guessed in a million years, as someone who lived in Washington for a long time, as someone who's testified before Congress, I never would imagine to see white supremacists running amok with Confederate flags and other signs of hate through the halls of our Congress, literally defiling the temple of our democracy. But in many ways, while it was shocking, I suppose it wasn't really surprising. The team of experts, researchers, and analysts in our Center on Extremism have been tracking extremists for decades. ADL has been studying the trends, monitoring the groups and movements longer than any other organization in the United States. We've been sharing intelligence and giving information to law enforcement for years to try to combat these threats. And you'll hear from one of our very talented analysts in just a few minutes. But since last week's attack, we've been in touch with law enforcement across the Capital Region, as well as across the country. The ADL has been helping to identify the extremists who participated in the violence. We've passed along the names and identities of dozens of people based on the painstaking work and the deep expertise of our staff. Just yesterday, ADL held a webinar for more than 1,200 law enforcement officials across the country, educating them on what we're seeing from extremists and helping them to prepare for the potential of violence next week at the inauguration or around the country. That's right. Our subject matter experts at ADL and our specialists on whom law enforcement really rely for information and analysis, we have been literally working in lockstep with the FBI and other authorities because we have the expertise and the specialization on this issue that often surpasses theirs. And to a great extent, I think what we're seeing right now is not just a threat to the Jewish community, it's a national security threat. And yet, while we see these white supremacists feeling so emboldened, it obviously has direct consequences for our community. Because while white supremacy didn't start with this presidency and it's not going to end next week, it is a domestic terror threat that demands the full attention of the Biden administration. And I'm hopeful that they will bring the attention to it. And based on my early conversations, I feel encouraged that they understand the dimensions of this threat, but it also requires our community to be organized, to be attentive, and to be vigilant. So I can tell you the ADL will continue to dedicate resources to fighting hate crimes, and we will work in lockstep with the Jewish Federations of North America, and we will work together with the Secure Community Network. And we will continue not just to make sure that our institutions are fortified in the real world, but to work online. And we'll call upon the technology companies to crack down on the dissemination of hate and social media to stop being a breeding ground for bigotry. And certainly, while everyone should have the right to express themselves as allowed under our Constitution, freedom of speech is not the freedom to slander. And freedom of expression is not the freedom to incite violence. And no one knows that, more intimately and more painfully than those of us in the Jewish community. Look, I'm excited to be here. I'm Delighted to have this opportunity, and I look forward to hearing from my fellow panelists. Thank you.
Jonathan, thank you. It's now my privilege to welcome a longtime leader, partner, and friend, Eric Fingerhut, President and Chief Executive Officer of JFNA.
Thank you, Michael and Jonathan and Mark and Esther. Thank you for the leadership that you have all provided in this important time. I'm looking forward to this webinar. It is exactly the kind of collaborative effort we need. Unfortunately, it's not what we would all like to be doing on a Friday afternoon before a 3-day weekend, Martin Luther King Day weekend, and with the inauguration ceremonies next week. But it is necessary and important that we be here. The 146 Jewish federations that make up the Jewish federations of North America are committed to building and maintaining the critical infrastructure that is needed to protect the physical security of our communities. Our federations each raise the funds, they hire and employ the security directors and often the security personnel for many agencies. They provide financial support, training, and logistical assistance to all of the Jewish communal institutions that they represent, so we can bring to the Jewish community the safety and security that our communities need in order to participate fully in Jewish life. In order to do this, we are proud to have helped create and support the Secured Community Network to provide the expertise and the depth of communications and connections that are needed amongst all of our security community directors and programs so that we can operate at the highest possible level of effectiveness for our communities. In addition to the critical work that SCN does with our local community security initiatives, it is also critical that we have and we share accurate, timely information about the nature of the threats and about developing trends. And it is for this reason that we are so proud to partner as well with ADL, with their superior ability to gather, track, and analyze the critical intelligence information that can be operationalized in our community security work. We must be exceedingly careful not to overstate the risks, but neither can we understate the risks. We must apply real, professional, experienced law enforcement and intelligence gathering skills to this work. And that is precisely what those of us in this partnership are doing. Most importantly, as has been mentioned by the other speakers, we must work together. JFNA will continue to build and support the local community security initiatives. SCN will continue to provide the expertise and the leadership across the networks to make sure that we're operating at the highest level of law enforcement skill and ability. And we know that our colleagues at ADL, as Jonathan has said, will not let up in their efforts to gather, disseminate, share, and analyze the critical trends that and data that we all need to have to move forward. We all remember the famous UJA slogan, "We are one." When it comes to securing our community, we truly are one. I'm grateful for the opportunity to work together with SCN and ADL, and we look forward to continuing to provide the clear guidance and support on security that each and every one of our local communities need. Thank you, and I look forward to the program.
Thank you, Eric. At this time, I'm pleased to introduce our colleague, Joanna Mendelson, Associate Director of ADL's Center on Extremism, who will share some of the amazing work that Jonathan and Eric both mentioned about what the COE is tracking in terms of anti-Semitism, hate, and extremism trends in this moment that SCN relies on, and that I can speak as a former law enforcement official, I know I relied on when serving. Joanna?
Thank you so much. Thank you, Esther, to Eric, to Michael, and to Mark and Jonathan for your incredible leadership. Good morning from Los Angeles, and good afternoon to the rest of the country, and early Shabbat Shalom. So fighting hate and extremism has never been more important. We live in an era of multiple simultaneous threats from a range of extremists and movements, which are increasingly skilled at exploiting technology to recruit and to radicalize followers. The ADL, as Jonathan mentioned, is dedicated to shining a bright light on those groups that operate in the shadows. In our brief time together, I will outline some of the broad trends we are seeing on the ground and the actions that we are monitoring. But I want to be clear from the outset in this security briefing. At this time, ADL is not aware of any credible threats of acts of violence that are slated to occur between now and the President-elect's inauguration on January 20th. However, if the very recent past is any indication, the combination of an extremist presence at events and the heated nature of online rhetoric suggests that violence is a possibility. And so it is prudent during this time that we maintain a heightened precaution, but not give way to fear or paranoia. We must be vigilant and observant, as you'll hear from our SCN partners, but it's important to be well informed. And so with that, next slide. Fighting hate and extremism is something that is coming front and center. Our staff monitors and disrupts extremist group activity on the ground and online. And so yesterday we briefed law enforcement to help give them the resources and the tools to identify threats and trends. We work with the tech industry, community groups, and other constituents because we need a wraparound response to how to deal with these threats. And you all are a very significant part of this as well, as observers and as community members engaged. Next slide. 2020's current events tested our nation. So we wrestled with this global pandemic and the subsequent lockdowns, Black Lives Matter protests throughout the summer, some peaceful, but some devolving into wanton violence, and a deeply contentious election cycle characterized by political discourse and vitriol. We saw flashpoints throughout the year marked by protests, arrests, and murders. We observed the mounting anger and subsequent protests at perceived government restrictions, limiting activity in the name of public health. We saw the rise of anti-government boogaloo movement that calls for civil war, resulting in several plots and tragically murders. We witnessed vigilante violence as a 17-year-old kid, essentially, was charged with murdering 2 men, taking law enforcement matters into his own hands. And we learned about an alleged militia plot to kidnap the governor of Michigan, which may have included a plan B to take over the Capitol to stage a week-long series of televised executions of public officials. 2020 was a difficult year. And with each of these flashpoints, momentum was built, ideology was further harnessed, and tactics were developed. Next slide. So looking back, as was noted, the Unite the Right rally of August 2017, we saw real-world mobilization of extreme actors. In fact, ADL Center on Extremism identified this and flagged this before it happened, that this was going to be the largest public extremist rally in the last decade. And it was. But we take that line and we draw it through to the current day. We follow that trail and we see that we have observed extremists feeling emboldened. We've seen them stepping out of the shadows and into the mainstream. We have documented the fact that white supremacists are engaged in an unprecedented outreach effort on American college campuses. We witnessed the unabashed embrace of anti-Semitic conspiracies, racism, and hatred that runs rampant. And perhaps sadly, our threshold of what alarms us these days has been lowered, and we've become desensitized to some of this rhetoric. Next slide. This rhetoric, ADL COE is documenting online. And we are going where the hate is. And I can tell you where we were monitoring last week is changing where we are monitoring today, as platforms are radically changing. But it is important to note that extremists are using technology and the virtual space essentially to weaponize hate. And so we are seeing them reach, recruit, and radicalize others into real world action. They use technology as their kind of proverbial mouthpiece, this megaphone to spread hate to a global community. We see disinformation efforts, which has been the core of sowing fear and anxiety and accentuating this division between various groups. We see recruitment and indoctrination, and we see the ability to live stream murderous attacks, whether or not the failed live stream in Poway or in Christchurch, where 51 Muslims were gunned down. We've seen robocalls being used by right-wing extremists to tell people to stay home and not vote. The lines are too long in communities predominantly African-American. We've seen them target religious institutions with swatting, these falsified calls to law enforcement to kick off a massive armed police response to result in frightening a community that is targeted. And so we see technology used as a tool as how they're targeting our community. Next slide. And as I mentioned, although we are not aware of any credible threat, we are certainly monitoring the rhetoric, and the rhetoric is egregious. We have to take extremists at their word. Currently, we're seeing online calls for continued violence targeting law enforcement and elected officials, and optimizing this energy, this now or never momentum, following the January 6th events. There are calls to shoot politicians and encourage an armed struggle and even a race war. On 4chan, we saw a poster that suggested that violence on January 6th was only a preview of what's to come by pro-Trump extremists that they would unleash on the country on Inauguration Day. And conspiracies about the election and now the insurrection continue to circulate, including the notion that Antifa provocateurs led the charge into the Capitol, or claims that Ashley Babbitt is actually alive, the woman who was killed in the Capitol, is actually alive, or is really just a crisis actor, in addition to other potentially dangerous disinformation elements. Next slide. So the sentiment doesn't just exist in the virtual space, and unfortunately, we've seen extremists translate this to real world and violent action. Next slide. We've seen this past year alone, we've become acutely aware how hate has festered, at times finding refuge in the ire aimed at religious institutions across the denominational spectrum. In fact, in 2020, we saw significant activity in attacks and plots against churches, mosques, temples, and synagogues. For example, in November 2020, in Las Vegas, Connor Klimo admitted to planning violent attacks against the ADL, a Las Vegas synagogue. It was a Messianic church, but he didn't know the difference, and an LGBTQ-friendly bar. And he was ordered to serve 2 years in federal prison. A month before, Pueblo, Colorado, Richard Holzer, a white supremacist, pled guilty to plotting to bomb a Pueblo, Colorado synagogue. Holzer also encouraged acts of violence against Jews and the Latinx community. And another example, in August of 2020, in Oak Creek, Wisconsin, Yusuf Beresnay, a member of the neo-Nazi base group, a horrifically extreme white supremacist organization, pled guilty in 2019 to targeting a Racine synagogue, Beth Israel Sinai congregation. He agreed to threaten and intimidate African Americans and Jews, who the group, the base, viewed as enemies of the white race. And they wanted to launch this larger plot called Operation Kristallnacht, a reference to the 1938 Nazi pogrom. And so we see all of these events of individuals who are motivated by ideology and spurred to act out in the real world. Next slide. ADL's been tracking since 1979 anti-Semitic incidents. And so we have a really good pulse of how we're faring as a nation. Our most current data shows that things are not well. In 2019, we documented that this was the highest total count in our 40 plus years of history of measuring this landscape. We documented 95 victims of vicious anti-Semitic violence, including the murders in Poway, California, Jersey City, New Jersey, and Muncie, New York. And in the coming weeks, we will have a sense of 2020's numbers, which will be equally disconcerting. Next slide. So on Wednesday, January 6th, pro-Trump extremists, including some identified right-wing extremists, stormed the Capitol, interrupting the congressional session and forced partial evacuation. The nation watched as chaos unfolded. This was pure insanity. Ideology, disinformation, mob mentality, and a deep sense of purpose all swirled together on January 6th. Next slide. But the invasion of the US Capitol is something that we predicted in many ways. We actually issued a memo saying we were heavily concerned about the increase in rhetoric and the plans for mobilization. We saw many of the people who aroused to violence at the Capitol are really the product of weeks and months and years of similar incitement. Next slide. So at the core are conspiracies, which are the lifeblood driving the current extremist landscape. There are so much elements of disinformation, whether or not it's the Sharpie Gate theory or the fact that the Dominion voting system was actually deleting millions of votes. We have provocateurs and conspiracy theorists like Alex Jones as poster children for dispensing a wide range of these truly asinine beliefs, speaking at rally after rally. And so there's a momentum to instill these conspiracy theories that people buy into. Next slide. They're baseless, and there is no evidence for anything identifying a stolen election. But that premise will continue to animate extremists for some time to come. So it is in this backdrop of swirling disinformation that there is this sense of loss, that something rightfully earned was taken away, and that the election was stolen. This both animates and ignites that sense of feeling wronged. And justification to act out against these wrongs is perceived as not only justified, but necessary. Next slide. And so just a little note of ADL's understanding of some of the things we've seen at the rally this past week, where anti-Semites implicate Jews and Zionists in DC violence. You may have seen images of one man wearing a hoodie that said Camp Auschwitz, written across the chest with allegations that the back said staff. We saw examples of an Israeli journalist harassed while covering the day's events, and white supremacists on Telegram who blamed Jewish mercenaries for the death within the Capitol rampage. Next slide. As Jonathan noted, ADL documented numerous extremists, over 60 individuals who forced their way inside the Capitol, linking images with footage, among them 17 identified white supremacists, QAnon adherents, Oath Keepers, Proud Boys, and militia. Next slide. We are seeing increased chatter in the months to come about various events that are taking place. Here's 3 of them in particular. And it's, although many of them have been canceled, we have seen that the digital flyers have still taken off and spread online. And so it's still kind of a TBD as to what will manifest on the grounds. Next slide. And finally, to conclude, the anger and vitriol we saw on January 6th will not dissipate anytime soon. Add to that the factor that this week, Trump was impeached in the House, moving a trial to the Senate. This will be additional fodder to those who feel aggrieved. We have our work cut out for ourselves, but in partnership with JFNA, SCN, and others, we look forward to shining a very bright light on the emerging threats and work to safeguard Jewish institutions nationwide. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanna. Now I'm pleased to introduce Chris DeReamer, SCN's Deputy Director of Intelligence, and Brad Orsini, SCN's Senior National Security Advisor, who will share an intelligence overview for the coming days and some physical security considerations for our Jewish community during this time. Chris, Brad?
Thank you, Michael. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a privilege and an honor to speak with you all today. Thank you to all of our participants for taking the time out of your busy schedules to ensure the safety and the security of the Jewish community. I want to start off by stating that at this time, SCN is not currently aware of any specific credible threats to the Jewish community. However, we all know that during these unprecedented times, the threat environment can change very quickly, which is why it is important now, as always, that we all remain vigilant, maintain good personal and institutional situational awareness, and follow established security and safety protocols at all times. I want to take a quick moment to talk about the term intelligence. There are all kinds of academic, corporate, and doctrinal definitions for the term, but the simple definition that I think captures the meaning, which is important to remember as we move forward, is this: intelligence is processed information that provides a decision-making advantage. Intelligence is not truth and typically does not provide a yes or no answer, but it can and does assist leaders at all levels with important decision-making, and specifically in our case, with decisions that can help focus our safety and security planning and preparedness. So with that in mind, what do we know from an intelligence perspective looking forward specifically for the coming days when it comes to the current threat environment? We know that the Federal Bureau of Investigation has warned that armed protests are being planned from January 16th through at least January 20th at all state capitals, and from January 17th to January 20th at the US Capitol. The FBI has also reported that an identified group is calling for others to join them in storming state, local, federal government courthouses and administration buildings in the event the president is removed from office prior to Inauguration Day. On a call with police chiefs from around the country held Wednesday, FBI Director Wray warned about potential attacks on state capitals, federal buildings, the homes of congressional members, and businesses. Officials stated that federal law enforcement and intelligence agencies are closely monitoring extremist communications online and have urged police agencies across the US to be mindful of potential lone wolf actors and local armed groups. The National Guard is providing troops in DC to boost security ahead of the inauguration, and governors around the country have begun elevating security at state capitals, including activation of their National Guards in preparation for anticipated protests and civil unrest leading up to Inauguration Day. Additionally, in a recently released joint intelligence bulletin, the FBI, Department of Homeland Security, and National Counterterrorism Center assessed that domestic violent extremists will very likely pose the greatest domestic terrorist threats in 2021. They further assessed that the January 6th violent breach by suspected domestic violent extremists into the US Capitol building will likely serve as a driver of violence for a diverse set of domestic violent extremists who perceive the event as a step forward in achieving their initiatives. Some domestic violent extremists view the 6th January event as a success and likely will also inspire some domestic violent extremists to engage in more sporadic, lone actor or small cell violence against common domestic violent extremist targets, including racial, ethnic, or religious minorities and institutions, law enforcement, government officials, and buildings. The violent breach of the US Capitol is very likely part of an ongoing trend in which domestic violent extremists exploit lawful protests, rallies, demonstrations, and other gatherings to carry out ideologically motivated violence and criminal activity. So with all that being said, SCN assesses that the civil unrest and rioting remain a serious threat to public and institutional security, specifically as political and ideological conflicts continue to dominate public discourse online and in communities around the United States. Additionally, as stated in the Joint Intelligence Bulletin, ideologically motivated threat actors may seek to mobilize during lawful protests or incidents of civil unrest, and that may cause a strain on available emergency services which can result in an overall elevated threat environment for our institutions. Leadership and security personnel are encouraged to remain situationally aware of individuals and groups that seek to exploit the current environment to promote anti-Semitic rhetoric and incite violence. Organizations and institutions should work proactively to review, adapt, and implement security plans and procedures to protect staff, visitors, and facilities. So now for the good news portion of this brief. Each of us can play a critical role in protecting the Jewish community and mitigating the current and future threats we are facing. First and foremost, it is important to understand the current threat environment in your specific areas. The current threat conditions in one area may be significantly different in another. The best way to accomplish building this understanding is by establishing and maintaining relationships and communication with local law enforcement. As always, notify law enforcement immediately if any issues or concerns arise. Secondly, we all need to maintain good situational awareness at all times, both in our respective facilities and institutions and in our day-to-day lives. While the threat environment is being monitored by a lot of capable entities, including SCN, the ADL, the US intelligence community, federal, state, and local law enforcement, no one knows your facilities and your normal operating environment better than you. You have home field advantage. As a domain expert, each of you are aware of what types of incidents or activities within your day-to-day lives and operations are suspicious. Please trust yourselves. And if something just doesn't seem right, contact your local law enforcement, your local security director if you have one, or as always in the case of imminent threats, call 911. And finally, please report suspicious activity and security incidents to the SCN duty desk as soon as possible. Unfortunately, we have seen numerous examples in the past where someone has come forward after a critical incident or a mass casualty attack with information that may have helped mitigate that attack. Many have said they didn't think the information was important, or they just weren't sure if it was relevant. This is why it's so critical to err on the side of reporting all suspicious activity and security incidents. A great example of this occurred just last week in Washington, D.C. On January 6th, a little over an hour before the US Capitol was stormed by rioters. Blocks away from the Capitol, a citizen who was working from home due to the COVID-19 pandemic took a walk through an alley near her home near the Republican National Committee office. As she was walking, something caught her eye, specifically what she described as a, quote, tangle of wires. She took a closer look and noticed the wires were attached to a pipe, which was capped on both ends, and the wires were attached to a radio dial. In her words, she thought, maybe this is a hoax, maybe this is a joke, but what if it isn't? She quickly notified security staff on site, who then contacted local law enforcement, who rendered the dangerous device safe. Her actions that day likely saved lives and prevented the taxing of emergency response resources that were drastically needed to address the rioting at the US Capitol. Her comments after the incident included this, quote, really the lesson is trust your gut. If something feels off or something catches your eye, you gotta tell someone. I think this is a great example of an ordinary citizen doing extraordinary things. Some recent examples of suspicious activities and incidents that have been reported to the SCN duty desk include, but are not limited to, suspicious photography, eliciting of information both in person and through email, vandalism, and attempted cyber incidents. If you become aware of these types of incidents, please report them to the SCN duty desk, as it is vitally important to report security incidents or suspicious activity so we can look for trends in reporting and conduct analysis of those possible trends, which can then inform intelligence production and inform the greater Jewish community. So what is our way forward during this current threat environment? During the days leading up to and on Inauguration Day, our SCN Command Center will be up and running. We will be coordinating very close with the ADL on information and intelligence sharing. If individuals or organizations have security issues or incidents to report, as I mentioned before, they should always contact law enforcement first. We would then ask that they either contact their community security director or regional security advisor. People may also contact the SCN duty desk directly if they do not know or have an RSA or CSD. In closing, I would like to state one more time that we are not aware of any specific credible threats to the Jewish community, institutions, or organizations. We are in unprecedented and extraordinary times, but if we all work together to mitigate these threats, we can ensure the safety and security of the Jewish community. The dedicated staff at SCN will continue to monitor threats as they develop, look for trends in threat reporting, and produce actionable intelligence that can provide you with a decision-making advantage. Thank you very much for your time today. And with that, I'll turn it over to Brad.
Chris, thank you very much. And just to echo, and not to be redundant, one of the biggest things we all need to do in each one of our organizations is to build that situational awareness, especially in light of the information that we saw last week, the incident at the Capitol, the civil unrest that occurred. Now, prior to the election this year, we actually had a webinar talking about potential civil unrest during the election and right after the election. We had the good fortune not to have it, but here we are. We have a document that we will be sending out to each and every one of you that talks about civil unrest and what we need to do to prepare physically our organization and how to answer those questions on whether or not we may have issues in and out of our community. Chris really hit the nail on the head about forging a relationship with law enforcement. And I'm going to get into that in 1 minute on probably the number one and number two questions we've been getting all week long from organizations across the country as they are preparing for next week. However, knowing that there is no threat directed at the Jewish community or any one of our communal organizations based off of what happened last week, we still need to remain ever vigilant in our community as we see that the people that entered into the Capitol were wearing the Camp Auschwitz shirts and all that signs of anti-Semitism during that attack. So really, folks, what we have in our control is how much we prepare. The document that and the notes that we're going to go through today and talk about will all be available to all at the end. And if we break down civil unrest, there's 4 major buckets that we all should be looking at. What are our operational procedures? What enhancements to our physical security we should be doing? Do we need additional security personnel? And then that protest preparedness. So the number one question that we have been getting all week long, do we need to close our facilities during the inauguration? And as Chris has stated, what we really need to do is take a local view of what's going on. And so if we are going to think about closing, think about enhancing our security posture next week, we need to rely on our state and local law enforcement to identify that true threat in our local area. And that should drive the answer of whether or not we close, whether or not we hire additional armed personnel. So really that operational procedure should be discussed right now. This is a good chance for us to break out our emergency operation plans, to review them, to convene our crisis leadership teams, our safety groups in each one of our facilities, and do that what if scenario. What if our local authorities give us a warning, and how are we going to react? We should be asking those questions now. We should be reviewing our access control policies. We should be thinking about limiting guests or visitors. We have so many Jewish communal organizations that cannot just close. If I think through all the organizations that I've visited over the last 4 years, we can't close our assisted living facility. So how are we going to prepare that facility for some type of civil unrest in a particular city? These are questions that we need to talk about now and coordinate with law enforcement. Is probably one of the most important things we do. We need to update those contacts that we have with our crisis template and our crisis response template. And also test any procedures that we have, whether it's one of our schools, whether it's one of our schools. Test those alarm procedures now. Make sure our panic buttons work. Make sure our mass communication procedures work to reach out to our community if we adjust our operational procedures. If we're looking to close early, if we're looking to close altogether, these are what we really need to be doing today and throughout the weekend as this threat unfolds. Again, not specific to the Jewish community, but we know that there may be unrest at all 50 capitals and other pockets of the country. It's just not limited to Washington, D.C. So we need to be very careful and consider all these operational procedures and adjust. Those Update emergency vendors. What do I mean by that? Make sure we know our contact at our alarm company, our armed guards and our contractors that we typically work with. Touch base with them this week to see if we have to adjust or hire additional guards. I'm not saying we need to do that, but we need to follow the procedures and the threat level in that local area. So if we talk about physical security during civil unrest, it's really, we're talking about securing the outside, the perimeter. We need to do that walk of our perimeter to make sure trash cans and dumpsters are emptied and locked, right? Things that people can pick up and use as weapons or break windows. Really important to understand, is there something different about my perimeter? Has somebody left something behind? Is there suspicious backpack or packages? We know when we prepare our law enforcement for G8s, G20s, or even a Sunday afternoon football game, you have groups of security officials walking that statement, looking for these pre-established rocks, bottles, whatever people use to riot and cause civil unrest. We need to test our camera system, make sure everything's working. Again, fire equipment, AED, life-saving equipment, make sure we have those items available and ready for use. Really important. And also be ready to shutter that facility and get people out there as quickly as we can. So very important. As we talk about security personnel, what do I mean by that? Do we need to increase that security posture? We may have a Jewish institution that's very close to the Harrisburg Capitol. I was talking yesterday to one of our Federation CEOs about what we should do, right? We should all assess the location of where our facilities are and what that threat posture looks like. And so if we do need to hire professional security, we need to be able to make sure those are available. And also when we talk about being prepared to shelter in place, when we really talk about countering an active threat, there's two separate and distinct things we always look for. One, how can we evacuate as quickly as we can? And how can we shelter in place and keep our community safe? So really, if we need to increase our security, armed presence, that is on a case-by-case basis, city-by-city basis. And the last is the protest preparedness. How do we work with the community? How do we work with our organization if peaceful protest, walk by our building? What are we working to message out to our stakeholders in our facility, our organizational staff, our lay leaders, our volunteers, right? We really talk about, really do not engage them. Do not engage counter protest. Be prepared to get away from them. And that's really what's important here. And as always, we encourage people to always respect everybody's First Amendment rights. So we don't want to engage and escalate a situation. And that's what's really important. And if I could just talk 1 minute, because I know I'm running short on time, what we need to do now is really have great situational awareness in our community. If we are an organization that doesn't have an emergency operation plan, doesn't do training, we really need to take this time now to be situationally aware. And awareness is really driven by 3 or 4 different items, right? Education, training, drills, and the ability to report. And that awareness through education, and awareness for education, know your threat, know your law enforcement officials, incredibly important. Training, we need to continue to train at a basic level. We need to train our community on situational awareness, countering active threat, stop the bleed, and then practice that with drills. And as Chris said, we need to report suspicious activity. If something does not seem right, we need to report it to law enforcement. We need to get ahead of it. We need to be great partners with law enforcement. We need to have that awareness. With awareness comes an empowered community. With an empowered community becomes a resilient community. And really, that's what we need to do. So if anybody out there is looking for training, looking for more guidance, reach out to us, sign up for our daily newsletter. You will see that situational awareness and incidents that happen across the country. With that, happy to answer any questions. If anybody has them, I know we're short on time. And with this, I'll turn it back over to Debbie.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I think you'll all agree that these presentations, while a bit unsettling, were certainly incredibly valuable. Unfortunately, we are a bit short on time, so I'm going to pull two questions that have been a bit representative of things that we have seen coming in the chat. So Joanna and Brad, if you could please turn your cameras on. Joanna, perhaps you can go first. Can you explain how to report an anti-Semitic incident to ADL and what happens once someone does do that? And once you're done, Brad, you've given us so much fantastic information, but if you would be able to pull out, what are the top 3 things that folks can do to help keep their institutions feeling comfortable and safe? So Joanna, why don't you go ahead?
Absolutely. So if you come across an incident in your community, see something, say something is really a critical vehicle to help inform everyone in the intelligence and law enforcement community. So if something rises to the level of suspicion or concern, definitely notify law enforcement. But we can also take that through adl.org/report incident. This is our incident database that we have experts across the country who are taking every single report, reviewing it, understanding potential problems and threats and concerns in each of the communities.
Thank you so much. Brad, please go ahead.
The top 3. Know law enforcement, engage with law enforcement, know who your local law enforcement is. You don't want law enforcement responding to your building the first time in an emergency. You want them in and out of your facility as much as possible. 2, full assessment of our facility to identify all gaps and vulnerabilities and to develop emergency operation plans and sound security procedures. And 3, 4, 5, and 6 is train our community. Please reach out to us. We're happy to come and train any community in security protocols. Deb?
Thank you, Brad. You had that ready to go. I am impressed. Thank you for that. Unfortunately, that does mean we are out of time for today. But to close us out, I would like to turn it over to Julie Platt, a member of the Executive Committee of the Board of Trustees at JFNA and chair of their Jewish National Security Initiative. Julie, please go ahead.
Thank you. If you are like me, you have listened to my partners and colleagues from the ADL, the Secure Community Network, and JFNA over the past hour with much concern. We have all seen the calls for armed violence next week, and we are worried. The United States is going through a very challenging time. That said, I also hope you feel great pride and confidence in the work being done on behalf of the Jewish community. We have an outstanding team, and we are working together in new ways to secure our American and our collective Jewish future, including strengthening our outreach and partnerships with other at-risk communities of faith in common cause. I'm from Los Angeles, a city that has been a top target for terrorists for more than a decade. At our Jewish Federation, we established strong partnerships with elected officials and local law enforcement, which enabled us to assess every Jewish facility in our community, so that today, nearly all Jewish classrooms, synagogues, and community centers have the training and tools to cope with threats. We are also able to monitor and track threats and respond. That said, we know that each year the threats have changed along with the attackers, and COVID has made the work even more challenging. Both foreign and domestic extremists have used the COVID-19 pandemic to recruit members to their ranks and to incite violence against Jewish and other minority communities. That's why I have stepped forward to lead the effort on behalf of JFNA and SCN to fill the gaps in communities that don't yet have the system in place that we have in LA, and to further develop those that do. We know that thanks to our collective lobbying, Congress has made available $180 million in security grants this year. We need to strengthen our community outreach, assistance, and capacity to ensure that our places of worship, schools, community centers, camps, human services agencies, and the like know about and have the capability to apply for and make meaningful investments in their physical security and preparedness through the federal grant opportunity. We also need to develop our security network and help and incentivize law enforcement to track and document hate crimes. As you have heard today, reporting is essential to understand, investigate, and prosecute hate crimes, and to ensure that Congress and law enforcement have an accurate basis to direct limited resources where they can be most impactful. And of course, we need to work together. That's why we are joined on this call here today. On behalf of SCN and JFNA, we are committed to our partnership with the ADL, whose indispensable work in documenting and calling out hate crimes ensures that the words never forget. The lessons of hate we learned from our painful past will ring. It is only through working together that we will be able to address the challenges ahead. Thank you all for joining us today. Be safe.